Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Laurie Anderson. I'm the Executive Director here at SFU Vancouver, and I'd like to welcome you here. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're having this event tonight in the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and I want to welcome you to SFU Vancouver Speaker Series. Tonight, we're really pleased to have a very prominent scholar with us tonight to talk about a very important issue. And this talk tonight is part of two things. One, the SFU Vancouver Speaker Series, a series of talks that we present to the public here in Vancouver. But it's also part of a new initiative just launched by the university called SFU's Public Square. And we have a number of the Public Square people here tonight who work with them. You raise your hand so you can see them, and they'll sign autographs after we're finished tonight. And the Public Square is really a reaffirmation of SFU's commitment and its tradition of being engaged, whether that's engaging students, whether that's engaging with research, or whether, as we're doing tonight, engaging with you, the larger community. And this is under the auspices of SFU Public Square. We're really glad to have our speaker here. I want to introduce you to now the person who has been very helpful in making this happen. Am Johal is our coordinator of community engagement, and I want to take this opportunity publicly to thank Am for all the great work he does in making sure that we engage so much with the community. So please welcome Am Johal.
I just wanted to acknowledge the support of Vancity in helping us establish our community engagement office here. Besides the talk this evening by Miloon Kothari, also on Wednesday evening, we have a partnership with the Indian Summer Festival where Miloon will be speaking about the realization of human rights in India on Wednesday night. And there's also a few other events happening later this week, including on Thursday. M.J. Akbar, the Indian journalist, will be talking about the geopolitics of Asia with former ambassador of Canada and with special guest Michael Byers. And on Saturday night, Urvashi Butalia, a feminist publisher and historian from India, will be speaking on Saturday night at 7 p.m. In the World Arts Center. Our moderator this evening is going to be Margot Young. She began her teaching career at the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria in 1992 after doing graduate work at the University of California, Berkeley in the fields of feminist legal theory and reproductive technologies. She later joined the UBC Faculty of Law, where she's co-authored and presented to United Nations committees on Canada's and BC's failure to comply with obligations under the Women's Convention. And more recently, she's working with Professor Penny Gerstein from UBC School of Community and Regional Planning on a housing justice research work. I ask you to join me in welcoming Margot Young. Please.
Thanks, Sam. I'm really pleased to be part of tonight's event, and I want to begin by acknowledging that our presence is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and to thank them. In 2007, Miloon Kothari, who was then the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, visited Canada for the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. His visit focused on 4 specific areas of keen relevance to Canada: homelessness, women's housing rights, housing in Aboriginal peoples, and the possible impact of the then impending 2010 Vancouver Olympics on housing in Vancouver. In the resulting report, presented a couple of years later to the United Nations Human Rights Council, Mr. Kothari noted a couple of contextual features, or several contextual features of housing issues in Canada that remain relevant today. First of all, the report notes that Canadian domestic law at either the constitutional or legislative level does not include explicit recognition of the right to adequate housing as either an enforceable right or a policy commitment. While Canada has signed on to these rights at the international level, such commitments are not enforceable domestically, nor has the Canadian government, at any of the levels of Canadian government, been particularly successful in voluntary and adequate observance of these international obligations. The report also went on to note the complex system of governance of shared governance between federal, provincial, and municipal governments that bears on housing matters. This is true particularly for our Indigenous peoples, but also for the immediate local issues of housing that face Vancouver. Canada, furthermore, is one of the few countries in the world without a national housing strategy, at either the federal level or at most provincial levels. The report was in sum deeply concerned and critical of the housing situation in Canada. A shortage of social housing stock stood out. Distressing and growing numbers of the homeless were observed in all parts of our country, but severely, particularly in our own downtown east side. Women, especially Aboriginal women, suffered disproportionate poverty and lack of housing affordability and availability. Effective and full government responses to these issues were missing. The result of the 2007 visit and the ensuing report was a series of recommendations for improving the housing situation in Canada. These recommendations emphasized such things as legal recognition of the human right to housing in our legal system, coordinated government housing policy, social housing programs, government coordination and cooperation between levels of government with respect to housing, and engagement with the unique needs of Aboriginal women and with women generally in Canada. 5 years later brings us to today, and homelessness and housing issues remain significant and pressing issues. 1 in 4 Canadian households experience a housing adequacy and affordability crisis. Remaining federal commitments to social housing threaten to disappear in a few years. At the municipal level, the situation is no less dire. Vancouver is known as the least affordable city in the world. Property prices skyrocket, rental units are inadequate in number, and out of too many renters' economic ranges. We remain a city where housing availability is shaped by too few housing options and persistent growing unmet demand. Our governments still have yet to step up to these challenges. Yet it is well accepted that affordable, adequate, and accessible housing is a critical social determinant of vital aspects of individual flourishing, of health, of social inclusion, and participation. Housing is also a critical factor in a strong economy, and it's central to a just and equal society. So the challenge remains ours, sadly so, in a country, in a city so prosperous and marked by at least the formal cognizance of the imperative of human rights. We are fortunate to have been able to persuade Miloon to visit us again on this occasion. His wisdom and experience as an outsider who knows us well offer the valuable opportunity for us to engage in the kind of critical, substantive, and sustained conversation that our aspirations to be a nation and a city that is marked by housing justice necessitate. And I want to end by just reminding you of a few of Miloon's accomplishments. He is an architect by training. He's been a guest professor at a number of universities around the world and is a leading voice at national and international levels on human rights, particularly social and economic rights. As I've already mentioned, he is the past Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, appointed in 2000 by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. This was a position that required annual reports to the Commission and then the Human Rights Council on the status of housing rights throughout the world. He is currently coordinator of the South Asian Regional Program of the Habitat International Coalition's Housing and Land Rights Network, and he is a founding member of the International NGO Committee on Human Rights in Trade and Investment. We're fortunate tonight to have as the central feature of the events that lie before us a presentation by Miloon. This will be followed by a short series of comments by Michael Shapcott, who's going to zoom in via Skype to us from Toronto. And Michael is the director of the Wellesley Institute, and I'll provide a bit more information about him before he appears on the large screen. After that, there'll be a short conversation between Miloon, Michael, and myself, and we'll follow that by an opportunity for questions from the audience, and hoping that we'll wrap this event up at about 9 o'clock. So all that's left for me then is simply to ask you to join me in welcoming Miloon Kothari back to Vancouver, to this stage, and to join again in conversation with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margot, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be back. I got a bit emotional when you were introducing me. I almost feel like it's a second home. I've been here so often recently. But it's good to be back. It's very disturbing to see that not much has changed on the housing front, but we have to keep on with our work. Before I begin, let me also acknowledge that we are here in the traditional territories of Slumlords Savashe. Apologies for not pronouncing it properly. All of you are probably wondering that someone who's been around for so long and been to so many places couldn't think of a more creative title to this evening's lecture. But let me try to explain that. What I'm going to try to do over the next half an hour, 40 minutes, is trace for you the history of the right to adequate housing, how it has developed, how it was actually civil society movements and campaigns that articulated what the right meant, and then that was taken up by different bodies in the United Nations, and then that articulation is now part of policy and law in different countries in the world. And one of the reasons why what comes from the United Nations has been my experience resonates very well with civil society groups and campaigns is because the language, the ideas have actually come from the grassroots. And I think that's very, very important for us to acknowledge. So the right to housing, the history actually begins in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which acknowledged housing, right to housing as part of a right to an adequate standard of living. And this was followed subsequently by the recognition of the right in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1966, in the Convention on Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and most recently, the Convention on the Rights of Disabled Peoples. And this right has, through the years, been developed by different bodies that monitor the implementation of these instruments that I'm mentioning. During the 70s and 80s, there was also work done on the right to housing through national courts. In particular, I'd like to mention the Indian Supreme Court, which in a series of judgments in the 70s and 80s said that the right to life includes the right to housing. They made a link between the struggle for a place to live and the right to life. And during the same time, there were international NGOs. There was an effort being made here in Canada, actually, which preceded the first global conference on human settlements, Habitat 1, in 1976, which then led to the formation of an international coalition, Habitat International Council at that time. And then there was very active work done again in the 70s and 80s by national campaigns around the world. I'll give you one example, the National Campaign on Housing Rights in India, which did an extensive survey of what housing meant in the country at the vernacular, at the local level. And the understanding was that for most people, housing is much more than four walls and a roof. It's actually a place to live, a place to belong. And that articulation was then, that was sent up to the UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which drafted something called a general comment, which was a legal interpretation of the right to housing in the covenant. And in the general comment, the committee acknowledged that the right to adequate housing should not be interpreted narrowly as a right to basic shelter or a roof over one's head, but rather, and I quote, as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. And then the comment clarified that the right to housing is integrally linked to other human rights and to the inherent dignity of the human person. The comment went on to to elaborate on 7 what they called essential elements of the right to housing, without any of those, the right to housing would not be considered to have been met or implemented. These were the legal security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, the question of affordability, the question of habitability, that housing had to be habitable, accessibility, location, the question of where it's located in terms of access to employment opportunities, health, education, and cultural adequacy. And this was the first attempt at the global level to actually explain what just a few words mean in the covenants and the conventions. After the committee drafted this recommendation, there was more work done at national levels, at global levels, which led actually to the recognition, the very strong and detailed recognition of the right to adequate housing in the Habitat Agenda, which is the document that came out of the second second World Conference on Human Settlements in 1996 in Istanbul. And then during that time, increasingly we saw the recognition in national constitutions. The South African Constitution in 1996 recognized housing as a fundamental right, a justiciable right. And the article that recognizes that says that everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing, and the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures to achieve this right. And third, no one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of court made after considering all the relevant circumstances, and no legislation may permit arbitrary evictions. I know many of you wish you had this kind of a recognition in your own charter, but it's interesting that there are countries in the South that have increasingly recognized that. Most recently, the Kenyan Constitution has a similar provision. Just now, the finalization of the Constitution in Nepal has a similar provision which recognizes housing not as a sort of, we call it directive principle or something to aspire to, but as a fundamental human right equal to all other human rights. So in the year 2000, when the Commission on Human Rights at that time decided to appoint a special rapporteur on housing, one of the driving forces was the dire situation in the world. At that time, the statistics were horrifying. 100 million people homeless in the world, 20 to 40 million in urban areas, and 1.6 billion people considered inadequately housed by the UN. That plus many submissions from civil society organizations around the world convinced the Commission. The Commission on Human Rights, and what is now called the Human Rights Council, is the highest intergovernmental policy-making body on human rights in the UN. So that convinced the Commission to appoint, for the first time, a special rapporteur on adequate housing to understand the scale of the problem and to make recommendations. So I was appointed in the year 2000. And when I began my work, just based on what had happened in the preceding 10 and 15 years, and I had been part of a lot of that, I reinterpreted the work on the right to housing to actually go even beyond where the other human rights bodies, like the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, had gone in their understanding of the right to housing. And what prompted me to do this was the firm recognition from my own experience that the right to housing is not just, as is articulated in the Covenant on Economic, Social, just the economic, social, and cultural rights, but it has many, many dimensions of civil and political rights. So in the interest of what is called the indivisibility of rights, human rights, it was clear that the right to housing cannot be separated from the right to security of the home, security of the person, freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment, freedom of movement, and so on. So taking into account the work that had been done until that time and this recognition of the right to adequate housing as as a sort of comprehensive and holistic right, I attempted right at the beginning of the mandate to put out a sort of definition of how we should understand the right to housing. And the definition said, and I'm quoting, that the human right to adequate housing is the right of every woman, man, youth, and child to gain and sustain a secure place to live in peace and dignity. So the idea was to capture the entire spectrum of what the right to housing means. And in doing that, in the subsequent years, I attempted to expand the elements that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights had identified. And I included elements such as freedom from dispossession, damage, and destruction, access to land, water, and natural resources, access to information, participation, the right to resettle and restitution, the right to privacy and security, and the right to access to remedies, and the right to education and empowerment. So you can see it was the initial attempt in the initial years of the mandate was to open up the issue to see what kind of responses were received from different sectors of society around the world. And I'm happy to report that during the course of the 8-year mandate, this interpretation of the right to housing was accepted by everyone. I don't think anyone really challenged that. There were some governments that said I was exceeding my mandate, but I took that as a compliment and I just continued. So during the course of those 8 years, I also identified I carried out 13 country missions. One of them was here in Canada, and visited a number of other countries, and I produced 8 annual reports which looked at different themes on the right to housing. And in that work, I identified a number of key obstacles to the realization of the right to adequate housing, and these are still with us. First was the issue of forced evictions. I found during the course of the work that actually millions of people around the world were being displaced from their homes for a range of reasons, but most disturbingly for development purposes, for large-scale development projects, for large-scale infrastructure projects, city beautification, mega sports events. And shockingly, one of the statistics that we came up with was that actually annually in the world, more people were being displaced from their homes because of ostensibly development than because of armed and ethnic conflict, which is quite a significant finding. And we found that most of the people who were being evicted, there was no prior notice, there was very little consultation, there was inadequate or no resettlement. So essentially, the direct result of that was the growth of homelessness around the world, the growth of slums around the world, and that many of the evictions were increasingly taking place because of market-based solutions, that it was actually speculation in land and property, the lack of rental protection legislation, and generally the sort of prominence or the preeminence given to markets by governments that was leading to people being displaced from their homes. The second main obstacle, of course, was homelessness itself, the growth of homelessness, the lack of governments to actually understand homelessness. I found very few governments that had an accurate assessment of how many people were homeless in their country, very few governments that had an appropriate definition of what is homelessness. And the third area, which actually I was able to study in great detail, was the issue of women's rights to housing and land property and inheritance. The Commission on Human Rights asked me, alongside my regular work, to actually produce a separate study on women's rights to housing and land. And we did a 4-year study that resulted in 3 reports and many regional consultations where we heard across the world voices of women at the grassroots. There was also a consultation held in the United States, which included women here from Canada. And some of the main findings of that 4-year study were that first was that I was quite shocked by the fact that there was a culture of silence when it came to women's rights to housing and land. There was no participation of women in housing, planning, other related policies. There was never any consent of women to the development policies. The second was that the ironic fact that while women's rights were being recognized more and more in law and policy, at the same time, the implementation was not there. So essentially, there was a huge gap between recognition and implementation. The third was the growing incidence of violence against women. And this was across the world. In fact, there are very disturbing statistics of domestic violence in Western Europe. The whole issue of violence, and violence also because of women being evicted from their homes and facing insecure conditions, and a range of other reasons. The fourth finding was that there are, when it concerns women's rights to housing, land, property, and inheritance, many countries that have conflicting legal regimes. So there are formal laws, there are religious laws, there are customary laws, and very little attempt being made to harmonize them consistent with international human rights recognition and law. And the other finding was that women suffered greatly because of multiple forms of discrimination. When I was on mission in Australia, I'll give you an example. I met a lady who was indigenous, an elderly indigenous leader who was disabled. And when she explained to me the obstacles that she faces on a daily basis, it became very clear that unless we have data and information at this type of disaggregated level, it's very difficult to think about what types of policy interventions are necessary to help people who have, women who suffer from multiple forms of discrimination. So that brings me to the other finding that was what surprised me when I was traveling around the world was generally a lack of assessment. I mentioned homelessness, but it was not only homelessness, a lack of assessment of the scale of the housing problem. First of all, I found that very few countries, as I mentioned, knew how many people were homeless, how many people were being displaced from their homes, how much land was being grabbed, there were no definitions to try to understand this. The second was that there was a lack of disaggregated data. So if you look at homeless people, how many women are homeless, how many Aboriginal people are homeless, how many children are homeless, this type of disaggregated data was, and I think, and continues to actually not be, there isn't an accurate assessment of that. Nor was there an assessment of the type of changes happening in cities. I mean, across the world, we've had this phenomenon of ghettoization, of segregation of communities, the building of what I've been calling apartheid cities, towns, and villages. And that type of spatial data, which would show you, which parts of the city who lives, was very much missing, particularly tracked over time, what the statistics people call time series data. The third finding was that even where there was information available, there was a lack of analysis of that information. So very often in many countries, I found that the statistical institutes or the census bureaus had information, but it was not used for policy. So there was just not enough understanding of the data that was available, and it was not, and even the data that was available was not used for policy formulation. The fourth finding, which I'll come back to, because I think this is very significant, was, of course, that one of the reasons there wasn't an accurate estimate is because a lot of energy went into what I call the obsession with growth and obsession with economic policies. So it was housing, and housing for the vulnerable was always seen as something that you have to do after the fact, sort of a band-aid thing or something, or simply a welfare or a humanitarian measure. So lack of assessment and scale of the problem. And this issue of growing speculation of land and property, no regulation or rules, very few rules for real estate developers, a great deal of corruption in the procurement of property. There's a growth of land mafias and cartels across the world, which include politicians, which include elected officials, which include bureaucrats. And therefore, there's little interest in meeting the housing needs of the vulnerable and the poor. There was also growing privatization as a result of global economic and other policies, privatization of civic services, water, electricity, so on. And I found that in one of the reports I did on the impact of global policies on housing, that privatization, there were actually three primary lessons that can be drawn from experience with privatization. One is that private businesses put too much emphasis on profits and cost recovery. It's not surprising. And privatization often leads to rate increases. Second, that service to vulnerable groups, so parts of the cities, towns where vulnerable people live, is inadequate and of poor quality. And many of the poor in many cities of the world, including in my own country, end up paying 20 times more than the rich for water. And the third is that privatization reduces the accountability and local control because multinational corporations, which lead these privatization schemes and projects, are accountable to their shareholders and not to the citizens in the countries where they operate. So this whole issue of the obsession with the market. If countries followed the right to adequate housing approach, what they would do is regulate the market, they would control speculation, actively intervene in the market, build social housing, have strong rental legislation, regulate banks and the whole process of mortgages, address housing subsidies for the poor, and create housing options and the whole concept of the housing continuum, which I will come back to. Instead, what we saw, and we continue to see, is increasing deregulation of the real estate market, the weakening of rent control legislations, the demolition of public housing, reduction of subsidies, increased, sort of places where there are 40-year mortgages, and essentially this obsession with home ownership, as if that's the only solution to the housing problem. And in a sense, when we look at the current economic crisis around the world, it's very interesting to see that the solutions that are being proposed come from that same neoliberal mindset. So the banks that have got us into these problems are the ones that are being bailed out, and there's something terribly wrong with that. So that's sort of just a quick overview of the work and the main findings of the mandate. I'll just spend some few more minutes on, so what is to be done? Where is the hope faced with such a huge scale of problems? And within the mandate from the Human Rights Commission and the Council, one of the tasks I was able to complete was to prepare what are now called the United Nations Basic Principles and Guidelines on Development-Based Displacement and Evictions. The idea was to prepare a set of guidelines, sort of operational guidelines that would indicate to municipalities and other levels of government the human rights safeguards that had to be put into place before, during, and after displacement, after evictions. So the guidelines attempt to give a definition. They say that evictions can only happen in exceptional circumstances, that there has to be adequate information, consultation, consent. There have to be eviction impact assessments. There has to be a right of people who are living in dangerous conditions to resettle, and there has to be adequate compensation. And the guidelines also, and this is, I think, for the first time in the UN that we have guidelines that that say that states are asked to take specific preventative measures to avoid, and I'm reading directly, avoid and or eliminate underlying causes of forced evictions, such as speculation in land and real estate. States should review the operation and regulation of the housing and tenancy markets, and when necessary, intervene to ensure that market forces do not increase the vulnerability of low-income and other marginalized groups to forced evictions. And I think you can probably identify with this very much here in Vancouver. And the guidelines go on in great detail to talk about other safeguards that are necessary, other preventative measures that have to be taken. The other recommendations that came out of the mandate, which can be helpful, is that, and it leads from what I was saying earlier about the lack of an assessment of the scale of the problem, was how do you actually make a better assessment, and what would that achieve, and what would that achieve, particularly in terms of holding the state accountable for the policies and for lack of policies and legislations. And how an accurate assessment would actually allow us to counter government propaganda that is there around the world, that actually neoliberal policies work for the poor. There's this belief, without any evidence, that rising tide lifts all boats, that there's a trickle-down effect, and all of that. So there were a number of recommendations on carrying out assessments and what that would achieve. The other idea which appealed to me very much, and which I've mentioned in many different parts of the world, actually comes from Canada. It's the idea of the housing continuum, that in any city you have to have a gradation of options for housing. You cannot only have shelters, a little bit of rental, and then mostly, home ownership. You have to have supportive housing. You have to have hostels where necessary. You have to have different forms of rental housing, cooperative housing, and so on. And unless you do this, you're not actually following a rights approach. And the other idea I wanted to share with you, and I think this is perhaps one of the most promising sort of concepts, and now being put into action, that has come out of the work on housing and other areas, is the whole concept of the right to the city. Essentially, the idea is very simple. It is that everyone who contributes through their work to a city's economy, a city's culture, social life, has the right to everything that city has to offer. I mean, that's essentially, in a few words, the concept. But the work that has been done in the recent years on interpreting the right to the city from a sort of overall human rights perspective is that we have to go beyond just the recognition of the right to the city that guarantees that, to guarantee that all human rights to all those living and seeking to live in city spaces, with a special focus on marginalized and vulnerable groups, and that the right to the city needs to encompass the ideals of an alternative, adequate, and ideal city, that it should encompass the principles of the indivisibility of rights, that the rights should be, there should be guaranteed to all women and men, youth and children who, irrespective of their economic status or identity, class, caste, and that there was a need for inclusive models of mixed-use city planning and development. The priority has to be given to vulnerable and marginalized groups, and there's a very good example of this in the form of a national legislation called the Right to the City legislation in Brazil, which is a legislation which actually calls on municipalities to designate what the law says are zones of social interest. So areas where vulnerable people live would be given special recognition. The people there living there, the communities, would be given security of tenure and provided with civic services. So the right to the city has actually received that type of legal recognition, at least in one country. The right to the city also includes the need for gendered cities and gender equality, the need for participation of everyone in the type of development that takes place. And very importantly, something that's a little bit complex, the terminology, but it would also include the right to non-retrogression, which essentially means that any advance that has been made in a city in terms of provision of social housing, in terms of protection of tenants, cannot be clawed back. So you cannot retreat from that, and if you do, then it would be a violation of the obligations that the city has. So, in a sense, the right to the city calls for the implementation of international human rights commitments. It calls for the harmonization of local and national laws with international standards. It calls for human rights-based reform of city policies and its development paradigm. And it calls for implementation of regulatory measures, what I was saying before, to check the unfettered growth of the market. So essentially, the right to the city as a concept encompassing a range of a bundle of human rights can become, and this is being picked up by movements around the world, very actively the work has gone on in Latin America, but it's also now being picked up in Africa and Asia. So the concept can become a powerful organizing principle for mobilization and advocacy. So the idea of the right to the city, and I think Margot has summarized the recommendations that I wanted to actually end with this recommendations I made in my mission report to Canada, but let me just spend a few minutes on that. The overarching recommendation was that Canada has to adopt a comprehensive and coordinated national housing strategy based on the recognition of the right to housing, that it has to give full legal recognition to the right to adequate housing. When I made my assessment, I couldn't think of another solution but that Canada has to embark on a large-scale program of building social housing, as it was doing in the 70s and 80s, and that there has to be a range of sort of measures taken, measurable goals and timetables for the achievement of housing for the most vulnerable. And there was a need, I found, a framework of tenant protection law was largely missing. And, of course, very important, the development of a targeted Aboriginal housing strategy. So, my conclusions, which actually Margot summarized, was that there was a serious crisis of homelessness and inadequate housing in Canada, and it was really surprising for me to see that in such a wealthy country there are such levels of inadequacy in housing, homelessness, and a range of other problems. So finally, I think that I wanted to speak a little bit more, but perhaps this can come up in discussion. I feel that the obstacles that we face are tremendous around the world, and we need to take all measures. We need to use the UN system as it is there. We need to go out on the street if possible. We need to there has to be much more mobilization on the issue of housing. And I wanted to end by actually reciting a small poem from Sudhir, from Sahir Ludhianvi, who's a very famous historically an Urdu poet from my part of the world, from the Indian subcontinent. And this might sound a bit, very sort of perhaps too strong for you, but in many parts of the world, it carries a deep resonance. And I quote, "If we fail to speak up today, deadly silence we will earn. Every home will be on fire, every dwelling will see burn. From beyond the silence then a cry of anguish will return. There's no one here, no one at all, no one." So I think we all need to work in our own spaces across countries and internationally to try to bring the right to adequate housing to a reality for vulnerable people who are all around us. Thank you very much.
It's really wonderful to have you back. And we now turn to the next section of this evening, which is first to hear from Michael Shapcott, who I think at any moment is going to come up on the screen behind us. But let me provide you just with a very brief introduction to one of our national experts on housing in Canada. Michael is well known for his work on housing equity and related issues at the local, national, and international levels. He is currently director of Housing and Innovation at the Wellesley Institute. The Wellesley Institute is an independent research and policy institute. Michael leads the Wellesley Institute's housing and homelessness practice, and he co-leads its innovation practice. So join me in welcoming Michael, and at any moment, I think he's going to be with us.
Great, thanks very much. I've lost I can't actually see you, but if you can see and hear me, that's great. So first of all, I wanted to say to Miloon, it's always good to have you back in Canada. It's great. The perplexing thing for many Canadians is why it's such a challenge to realize the right to adequate housing here in Canada. As Miloon mentioned, one of the fundamental observations in his fact-finding mission was that we have a serious crisis in Canada, yet we are an incredibly wealthy country. We also are a country that has a long association with fundamental human rights, including the right to housing. In fact, if I can be slightly nationalistic, going right back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it was a Canadian law professor, John Peters Humphrey, who helped to co-author the original Universal Declaration and the original notion that housing is a fundamental human right. So in 2007, so 5-6 years ago, when we began to plan for Miloon Kothari's fact-finding mission to Canada, we were all very, very excited. Some of us kind of imagined that Miloon would be kind of like a housing rights superhero, that he would swoop into the country, he'd have a cape, and he would proclaim housing justice for all, and during the course of his several weeks in Canada, that would usher in a new era of housing rights. Of course, it doesn't work that way exactly, even though Miloon is a very formidable personality and, as you've heard, has had a big impact. I wanted to mention a few things, however, that did happen as a direct result of Miloon's fact-finding mission in 2007 and some of the subsequent things that happened. And these happened because Canadians took up the mantle of housing rights and worked very hard to ensure there was a realization of housing rights. So one of the first things that happened as a direct result and as an impact of the fact-finding mission of the Special Rapporteur in 2007 was that in 2008, the federal government announced a 5-year extension of its National Homelessness Program, its National Affordable Housing Initiative, and its National Low-Income Housing Repair Program. Now, none of these programs are adequate to meet the national need, but they were the best that we had on offer. And during the fact-finding mission, we were very clear in saying to Miloon that we wanted to ensure that these programs were preserved and enhanced. And indeed, the federal government did announce a 5-year extension of those 3 programs. Even more significantly, a year later, the federal government, in its 2009 stimulus budget, the federal government announced that it was going to make a major commitment to affordable housing spending, a $2 billion affordable housing spending. That same year, Canada was in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which, as Miloon has already said, is the highest human rights body within the UN system, for the first universal periodic review of Canada's human righs obligations, including our right to housing. And at that universal periodic review, there was a network of civil society groups from all across Canada who had been inspired by the fact-finding mission of Miloon, and who took the challenge of bringing the real stories of the denial of housing rights to the very footsteps of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And in that Universal Periodic Review, not only did we receive a judgment from the United Nations Human Rights Council that Canada, in fact, had fallen short in meeting its international housing rights obligations under various international legal instruments, but even more perhaps surprisingly to us, the Canadian federal government, the current government, the Harper government, in June of 2009, it actually said back in its formal response to the United Nations Human Rights Council, it said that they accept the criticism that it's fallen short in terms of meeting the housing rights of Canadians. And I want to just read to you what the Canadian government said in its formal response to the United Nations. Canada acknowledges that there are challenges, and the Government of Canada commits to continuing to explore ways to enhance efforts to address poverty and housing issues in collaboration with the provinces and territories. So we had a clear statement from the federal government, not that it was going to blow off the criticisms from the Human Rights Council, but it was going to take them on and was going to work with the provinces and territories. So this is a series of very, very important, not total victories, but very important advances in terms of housing rights in Canada as a direct result and as an impact of the fact-finding mission of 2007 and the Universal Periodic Review of 2009. Unfortunately, however, there tends to be a very short attention span when it comes to politicians, and what Miloon has called the Neoliberal Agenda, or what our Canadian government refers to as austerity, which is a kind of government-manufactured scarcity. The austerity agenda began to kick in with vengeance, especially in 2011, last fiscal year. That year alone, the federal government made a 39% cut in housing. So almost all of the funding that it had added in 2009 was cut away. It reduced in 1 year from $3.6 billion to $1.9 billion its overall national affordable housing spending. It made a substantial cut in Aboriginal housing funding, and all of you in the audience are there on Coast Salish land. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional home of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Aboriginal people all across the country had received some special recognition in terms of new housing and new programs as a result of the fact-finding mission of Mr. Kothari in 2007, but that money was cut by 27% in 2011 and further cuts this year. More dramatically, in terms of overall dollar cuts, the 2011 budget included a 97% cut. Almost every penny was cut out of the Federal Affordable Housing Initiative, and a 94% cut in the National Low-Income Housing Repair Program. So we have these deep, serious cuts. And when Miloon talks about the human rights principle of non-retrogression in Canada, you can use the word austerity. You can substitute the word austerity, that what our government is doing is actually retrogressing. It's seriously undermining, it's cutting commitments that it made. So in 2009, when the federal government said to the UN Human Rights Council, following the Universal Periodic Review of 2009, that they were going to enhance their efforts, they've in fact done just exactly the opposite. So finally, that sort of takes me to where is the potential, and we of course have Miloon back in the country to inspire and educate us and continue to help us to think strategically about this, but I want to offer a few options from a national perspective. One is that there is a bill in front of our Parliament, Bill C-400, a private member's bill. It was proposed by Marie-Claude Morin, who's a NDP MP from Quebec. But the roots of this bill are actually, in fact, the language is almost word for word, a similar bill originally introduced by Libby Davies, well known to everyone there, a dynamic Vancouver member of Parliament, one of Canada's housing heroes, and heroes in many other ways as well. Bill C-400 is in front of National Parliament, and it would seek to do exactly what Miloon has said that Canada has failed to do, which is to recognize and bring into Canadian law our international housing rights obligations, and then set up a process to ensure those rights are fully realized. Second thing that's happening is a charter challenge. There has been, especially since 2007 and the fact-finding mission, and a growing recognition of the power of the human rights framework as a practical tool in a legal context to be able to advance housing rights. There have been actions at the municipal level in a number of parts of the country. Here in Ontario, a city called Kitchener, a sort of medium-sized city in central Ontario, had a discriminatory zoning bylaw, a bylaw which said that group housing couldn't be allowed in a certain neighborhood. That was struck down on housing rights grounds. This is, as far as I know, a first in terms of Ontario planning law. But the Charter Challenge seeks to step that up one step, and it's actually a challenge under the Right to Life section of Canada's Charter, and arguing that the Canadian government's actions, in fact, constitute a violation of the fundamental right to life, and seek to read into the Charter Canada's international housing rights obligations. Now, predictably, the federal government and several provinces have said that the courts have no jurisdiction to hear this charter challenge, and so we're in the preliminary arguing stage about whether or not the case will go forward. I'm pretty confident it will. So I wanted to just end by saying I think one of the most powerful things that we've all learned from our association with Miloon and the excellent work he's done in Canada and around the world is something that I can remember from many years ago being on a bumper sticker. The bumper sticker said, "Human rights, ignore them and they'll go away." What Miloon has reminded us is on the positive side that if we embrace our human rights and we creatively take them up in struggles, in budgets, in legislation, and in the courts, then we can actually work to realize those human rights. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. I want to open the conversation between the three of us by returning to a thread in your presentation, Michael, and particularly the one on which you ended, which is the notion of the relevance of human rights and the levels at which human rights are expressed and operative. So in Canada, we have human rights legislatively through human rights codes passed by governments, by provinces, and by the federal government. We have a constitution, which is a charter of rights and freedoms. In particular, as Michael mentioned, Section 2 protects life, liberty, and security of the person, a right potentially relevant to housing issues. And then we also have a series of international documents to which Canada signed on. Michael, you gave us a good sense of some of the impact of Miloon's mission report, but you also conveyed very clearly that the government has stepped back considerably in recent years from what might be positively ascribed to the impact of that report. Can I ask both of you, and maybe starting with you, Miloon, to talk a bit about, from your perspective as an expert in international human rights and in the United Nations human rights system, how we as Canadians in our housing activism might take advantage of human rights internationally to further, really human rights on the ground nationally in Canada and locally in Vancouver. And then I'm going to come to you, Michael, to sort of feed into that conversation from your perspective as a Canadian activist, how you concretely use human rights at an international and a domestic level.
Yeah, thanks very much, Margot, and thanks, Michael, for your excellent presentation. I think that actually the time, between now and when Canada has to go back to the Human Rights Council for its second Universal Periodic Review is a very critical and important time, because this is the time when what they're not doing can be exposed to the UN. Essentially, the Universal Periodic Review is a peer review process where every member state of the United Nations reviews the human rights record of every other member. So there's a lot of pressure on countries to go back to the Council and show progress, show that the recommendations that they accepted have actually been implemented. But obviously countries are not going to do this on their own. So the role of civil society, the role of independent institutions in Canada is very critical to bring out these reversals that are taking place. And it's not only the reversals. I think even where there have been advances, it's important to recognize that in this work, so that it's not only criticism. And I actually wanted to ask Michael, when you do respond, if you could also refer to some other positive developments in other provinces, I think that have happened, including the excellent work done by the Ontario Commission on human rights. So I think it's a major opportunity now, and perhaps this is very timely that everyone comes together again on the housing issue.
Yeah, it's very interesting because really what you're saying is that given that we're going into our second Universal Periodic Review, which is a review of Canada by the Chief Human Rights Council at the United Nations of the full range of human rights obligations across all the treaties to which Canada has committed, that we've got the recommendations of the first Universal Periodic Review to use as a kind of leverage and benchmark to say, okay, Canadian governments, how are you meeting these concerns? What's happening given that you've been given notice by countries? So that's
and especially because Canada, explicitly accepted the housing rights recommendations, which came from before. So that gives a major opportunity.
Right, great. Michael, we'll bring you in.
Great, thanks. Margot and I share a little bit of history in the sense that many years ago we both walked the halls of the University of Toronto Law School. And when Margot left law school, she went on to a distinguished career as a law professor. I went into the neighborhood to organize homeless people in the East End of downtown Toronto. And in those early days, one of the ways we thought that was a powerful way to actually get the attention of what Martin Luther King Jr. used to refer to as the competent authorities was to appeal to people's sense of compassion. So we would ask people to tell their stories of how terrible their lives were. And we hoped that somehow we could squeeze some pity or compassion and therefore get some action from government. The human rights approach is actually very powerful because it turns that whole thing on its head. And rather than having to have people who have been forced to be homeless, or people who are poor, or people who have faced systemic racial or other barriers, rather than forcing them to kind of tell their stories and hope that someone will take pity on them, the human rights approach says everyone has dignity, and it's actually up to governments to take the responsibility. In the UN system, they sometimes refer to the process of enforcing human rights in a less legal or scholarly way as naming and shaming. And this is really what we started to do during the 2007 fact-finding mission with Miloon, with civil society groups wanted to shift the focus away from the tragic stories of people who were getting sick and dying because of their lack of housing, and shifting the focus to governments and the actions that governments were taking in terms of creating the conditions in which way too many people in Vancouver and Toronto and elsewhere were dying on the streets. And so this naming and shaming process shifts the balance fundamentally. It restores a sense of dignity and inherent value to every human being, whether they're housed or not housed, whether they're rich or poor, whatever their gender or their racial identity. And I think that's a very powerful framework. And I certainly saw that as Miloon was, I had the opportunity to sit in the room when Miloon had several meetings with various groups, and I could see how powerful the human rights focus was. But of course, it's important to go beyond just simply the sort of question of talking about what rights mean in the abstract, and talking about what rights mean in actual concrete terms. And so Miloon mentioned the Ontario Human Rights Commission. We've had a Human Rights Commission in Ontario which since 2007 has really taken housing rights very seriously and has incorporated that in substantial ways into its work. It's looked at a whole range of issues, everything from the rules that set rents in subsidized housing through to welfare rules, through to asset rules that also cover people who are on various forms of social assistance, to local planning and zoning rules, and looking at ensuring those rules are in conformity with basic international human rights standards. And we've made some substantial progress. We've had a number of municipalities which have already changed their planning and zoning rules to ensure they're in more conformity. I think the naming and shaming process has to has to continue. And at the national level, what we have to, of course, continue to do is to point out the contradiction between what our government said in 2009 in response to the initial Universal Periodic Review and the upcoming Universal Periodic Review in 2013, which we're already beginning to prepare for now, and there's already a network of NGOs across the country that are gathering information to bring that process forward.
Maybe we can expand this conversation to talk beyond the federal government. So, Miloon, you mentioned you would be interested in hearing a bit about what measures have happened or need to happen at the provincial level, and we could also move that to municipal level, because one of the features of Canada's legal system is that all three levels of government are in some way implicated and necessary to effective housing policy. Michael, I'm going to go back to you and see if you can expand your consideration to talk a bit about the provincial level and then the municipal level. First, in relation to the impact of activists like you using international human rights to name and shame or to gain some sort of leverage on the ground, and then more specifically in terms of what kinds of best practices can we observe across Canada. And then, Miloon, I'm going to turn to you to join the conversation.
Well, thanks, Margot. Canadians tend to, their eyes tend to sort of get a little bit bleary when we start to talk about Constitution. But in 1867, when the British were nice enough to allow Canada some measure of a little bit of independence, and they gave us the Constitution, British North America Act of 1867, the word housing actually doesn't appear in the original Constitution. And I think the reason was that in 1867, most Canadians, it was a rural country primarily. If you needed a house in 1867 in Canada, you went out and chopped down some trees and you built a house. It wasn't thought of as being something that was part of government. And when the Constitution was updated in 1982, housing was still not mentioned as one of the powers of the provinces of the federal government. That hasn't, however, stopped politicians at all three levels, or four levels if you add in the territories, from pointing fingers and saying housing is a provincial responsibility, it's a federal responsibility, and so on. And this is an issue that bedevils federal states. It's an issue in Australia. It's an issue in other countries that have inherited the system of federal government, is that it does allow a certain amount of buck passing. Now, I do want to say there have been times in Canada's history when the federal, provincial, and territorial governments have actually agreed on housing issues. In 2001, all the provinces, territories, and the federal government signed the Affordable Housing Framework Agreement. It was a temporary 5-year deal to put what eventually became about $3 billion into affordable housing. We've had other moments in the history of Canada where governments have actually gotten together and worked on that. But our federal system of government is often used as a way for governments to blame each other. In the current political context, however, municipalities over the last 10, 15 years, because of the way our conservative or neoliberal governments have been working at the federal level in many provinces, they've been downloading or dumping more and more responsibility for big social issues, including housing and homelessness, onto municipalities, which have the least amount of fiscal and other resources to deal with these complex issues. And municipalities have been pushing back. They started pushing back in the 1990s when Jack Layton was the president of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. He really mobilized municipalities. And in the last few months, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has issued another document. They've been ringing the alarm bells about the fact that in 2014, our National Homelessness Plan is due to expire. The Affordable Housing Initiative will be zero. The federal government will continue to make further cuts to housing and homelessness programs. So municipalities are actually rising up, and they're saying that we're prepared to be part of the solution, but we can't take on all of the responsibility ourselves. At the provincial level, we've actually seen some strange things. I say strange because there are some provinces that we didn't expect to take some leadership on these issues have. I'm thinking of Alberta, for instance, which most Canadians think of as being the kind of conservative heartland of Canada. On a per capita basis, Alberta, more than any other province, has been putting more money into housing and homelessness programs in a smarter and more effective way. And that's largely because civil society groups and municipalities have created some very effective alliances in a number of Alberta cities, and they've really put the pressure on the provincial government. Similarly, in Newfoundland and Labrador, a lot of good work is beginning to happen in that province because civil society is working together with municipalities, and they've convinced the provincial government to be a partner. So we're seeing some positive movement in parts of the country that are overcoming this finger-pointing exercise of federalism that often happens. Now, the final thing I want to say about this is that, and this going back to the work that Miloon does, that oftentimes when Canada appears at the Human Rights Council or in other international reviews, Canada is asked, is your federal structure the reason why you can't take action? Is that the reason why you don't have a national housing plan, even though every other civilized country in the world has a national housing plan? And every time Canada says, no, that's not the reason, there are other factors behind it. So, you know, again, I don't think we can blame federalism for the fact that we have, especially at the federal, provincial level, governments in many parts of the country that are actively hostile to realizing the right to housing, to committing the kind of resources that are necessary to realize that right.
Thank you. Miloon, do you want to add anything to the sort of shell game of federalism that often characterizes Canadian politics around housing?
Yes, I found this on my mission very much, that, you know, different levels of government blaming each other for the lack of housing solutions. But I think this is another reason. Well, there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is that this is really what is really important is that there's a national strategy. And that national housing and homelessness strategy has to have as one of its main planks improved collaboration amongst various actors, including federal, provincial, territorial, municipal governments, and civil society. And I think so there's no getting away from the fact that, I mean, it is one country, so you need to have a national strategy. The other point, of course, is that I still don't understand why, even if funding was not coming through from federal and provincial levels, I don't understand why municipalities, because most cities in Canada are very wealthy. I mean, Vancouver is a good example. Why is it that they cannot come up with more creative solutions to find solutions to the problem of homelessness, of affordability? There is land availability. There are some legislative restrictions which need to be overcome, but surely municipalities can do more and not use as an excuse the fact that, while this federalism issue is being sorted out, not use that as an excuse to say, well, we cannot do anything. I don't accept that, particularly in a country that is so wealthy.
That's an interesting comment, and it reminds me of some of the comments you made about the right to city, and that's a term that's particularly trendy among academics. But I'd be interested in hearing, Michael, something from you about how relevant that kind of expression is as a kind of not just mobilizing rhetoric, but also as a meaningful way of framing what we expect our cities to be doing. So, Miloon, you talked a bit about some of the larger notions of human rights observance that come out of discussions around a right to city, but in terms of concrete policies and then the usefulness of this politics of the rights of a city to actually get us those concrete policies at a municipal level, it's, I think, still unclear. Michael, what's your sense from Toronto and your experience with other Canadian cities?
Well, I think, first of all, Miloon is absolutely right that too many municipalities in Canada do hide behind some of the more arcane constitutional provisions. It's true that municipalities in Canada are particularly weak in our constitutional structure. They're creatures of the province and only allowed to do what provinces explicitly give them power to do. But there's actually a fair amount of room to play in that. And I think that let me give you an example of a housing rights struggle that's very local in my hometown of Toronto. We have in Toronto an affordable housing waiting list of 85,088 households. That is what it means in practical terms is that if somebody goes on a list today, it'll be about 24 years before they're actually given a home because there's so little housing. So there's 85,000 households. That was in May of 2012. That's an all-time record. The previous record was set in April, the one before that in March. In fact, every month since 2008, the affordable housing waiting list has set a new record. So there's clearly something going on in terms of a crisis of affordable housing in Toronto, yet our current civic administration says that it needs to sell off a significant portion, more than 700 affordable homes that are owned by the City of Toronto's Public Housing Agency. And this is a decision that the city has made that flies in the face of the reality on the ground of an acute housing shortage. And I think it just sort of speaks directly to the issue that Miloon is raising, that municipalities often cry that they have limited ability to be able to address issues when in fact there's a lot they can do. In most parts of Canada, although we've had a growing homelessness disaster and housing crisis for almost 2 decades now in many parts of Canada, we actually haven't had a problem in terms of the production of new housing. In most parts of Canada, there continues to be a fairly robust supply of new housing. The problem is, of course, that the housing we're building is not affordable for low and moderate income households. It's not affordable for women who are fleeing situations of violence and being forced into homelessness because of violence, youth who are fleeing physical and sexual violence, being forced into homelessness. The housing is not being built for them, it's being built for the more wealthy people. So there are tools that are available to municipalities to allow them to ensure that a portion of this new housing is actually geared to the people who actually need it, but very few municipalities actually take up those tools and use them in a practical way. So I think that while there's certainly a lot of blame to be shared across all levels of government in terms of who are the authors of the manufactured housing crisis that grips almost every part of Canada. Certainly, municipal governments can't get away from that. But I do want to say about the right to the city that I think what's so profoundly important about this emerging recognition, and Margot, it's so important, as you've recognized, that academics are spending time building out this right and understanding what it means in all its dimensions, but what it means on a practical level for a single mom in an urban area in Canada is that housing is connected to food, is connected to income, is connected to education, is connected to transportation, and all those things are indivisible. And too often in our approach to these issues, we come at the sort of 19th century British civil service silo approach where we have the housing issue and we'll tackle that in one box, and we'll put the income issue in another box, and we'll deal with racial exclusion in another box, and we'll deal with other issues in other boxes. And yet I think what the right to the city does is it's a radical attempt to fuse everything together and say that when people live their lives, they don't live it in little bits and pieces, they live it as a whole, and we need to ensure the city actually meets that bundle of needs and issues and rights.
Yeah, and I think one of the important pieces of the theory around the right to city is the recognition that people live in space. And these days, most people live in urban space. And it's a recognition of the necessary spatialization of rights, that as we build our urban spaces, we also facilitate or deny access to essential aspects of flourishing in the city. And so the conjoining of all the kinds of human rights and guarantees of a full and substantive citizenship as recognized in urban spaces is really a critical concept to thinking about the local politics of what I think of as a just society. Miloon, did you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's actually a global charter of the right to the city which is being accepted more and more by municipalities. There are different municipalities. I don't know if I'm wrong, Michael, but I think Montreal has a charter on the right to the city. I don't know how, what that means in real terms. Mexico City has, several European cities have, and they're saying that everything that we do in terms of municipal decision making will comply with this charter. And most of these city charters are actually consistent with international human rights obligations. It's interesting in some countries where even the national or the federal government has not recognized international. Cities are going ahead and saying, yes, it's the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights is very important, and we would like to comply with that. So there is a growing movement for that, and I mentioned the legislation on the right to the city from Brazil. So we even have an example of a very powerful national legislation. So certainly it's much more than just a concept or an idea. I think increasingly every year it's being substantiated, and it can very easily be adopted. And it's something that civil society can mobilize for.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience for their comments and questions. But Miloon, I want to pick up on a comment that you made during your presentation about this reliance on the market, and also the prevailing notion that the goal with respect to housing is home ownership. These are two dominant ideas, certainly very powerful and prevalent in Canada. Can you comment a bit on your critique, at least your implicit critique in your presentation, of the idea of market as housing solution and home ownership as what we really should be thinking about as the goal for housing?
But I think the basic problem starts with the fact that governments increasingly view housing as a commodity. It's something you buy and sell, something that's out there in the market, something that is there for investment, something that's there for speculation, and there's nothing done about that. Instead of viewing housing as a social good, as something that is a very primary and a daily need of everyone. So there's been a move away from the social function of housing and property to just making it into a market issue, and I think that's fundamental. The second problem is that across the world we have the sort of tremendous unprecedented growth of the real estate lobby, and the amount of money that is being generated by developers, by even multinational corporations working on real estate issues is such that it creates a momentum of its own, which is very powerful, and it's very difficult to counter that. When you combine the levels of corruption that are there, when you combine the levels of just benefits that accrue to everybody, including politicians and bureaucrats, it becomes very difficult to see how to counter that. So that's why there's a fundamental need to rethink what we would feel about housing, and really to again restate time and again that it's a human right. It's not just a commodity.
And what about home ownership and the housing continuum, of which there's some claim to Canadian origin? Can you expand a bit on that idea as counter to the notion that the goal for housing for everyone is ultimately to own their own home?
Absolutely, because when you look at income levels, when you look at the conditions in which people live, it's very clear that not everyone is going to be able to afford to own a home, right? So you have to have other options. You have to have rental housing, cooperative housing. In fact, the Canadian model of cooperative housing is, that started off in the 70s, 80s, is used all over the world as a good practice, and yet it's slowly being abandoned here. And I understand that even the government subsidies to that are going to be cut in the coming years. So the idea that you have to have different housing options and not only have an option of just home ownership is very, very important. But the housing continuum has to be coupled with legislative protection, and rent protection is very, very important. And I'm actually very surprised to hear in Vancouver that you have this possibility where a landlord can say, well, I want to renovate the apartment and evict the tenant and then raise the rents. There are no limits, which is unprecedented. I don't think anywhere in the world we have that. I mean, there has to be a cap on that, right? You cannot just raise rents and then obviously the person who was there would not be able to come back, and it contributes to the process of gentrification. So the housing continuum also means that you have to protect those. So if in a city you have a certain percentage of housing that is rental, you cannot then convert it into condominiums or whatever and change the land use. So there are lots of ideas around that, and I think it's very important that the options are are protected, and that's a fundamental obligation of the government.
So we're going to go to our first audience question.
Hello.
Hello.
My name's Andrew Perry. Thank you for the talk tonight. There's a lot to think about. But with all due respect, I really feel that it's really misguided with the approach. Why I'm coming from is, instead of looking at a right to housing for all, what if we were to look at that no one has the right to privatize the wealth from the earth and land? I think that land issues is actually the key to a lot of this. If anyone here is a homeowner, on your last assessment, you probably see that your land is actually worth a ton, while your home is relatively worthless. Someone that I just spoke to, their assessment went up $100,000 to $650,000, and their home was actually worth $17,000. And so you were talking about how the market was actually driving up the cost of things with speculation, but I'd like to correct that it's actually a rent-seeking activity. So rent in classical economics was recognized as compensation for the use of land, and all land is land titles. It's all invisible lines drawn to people. So if we were to actually move towards a policy of moving up towards like a 90% land tax, where you essentially would drive down the cost of land to nothing, so it wouldn't be incentivized for people to speculate, so their capital would go into more productive forces as well. You would actually give maximum utilization to land so that people would build higher capacity for jobs, for homes, and if you actually distributed that equally to all citizens as a dividend, that would contribute towards a basic income guarantee, and I think you'd see that labor costs would drive up through that. So also on the political end, I just want to make a final point here, is that when you're looking at human rights, a lot of what we were talking about are positive rights. So positive rights to housing and to education, these are very political. Conservatives are vehemently opposed to these sort of things. So if we were to look at the negative rights of opportunity and access, this is something that comes from all of the classical liberal tradition, John Locke, Adam Smith. So I think you could actually unify a lot of people instead of making it a divisive issue. So I like to consider looking at the land issue rather than housing.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Michael, I'm going to turn to you first, just because it gives me an opportunity to see if your voice is working.
Well, can I first just quickly say on the housing mortgage issue, before taking up Andrew's issue, that just yesterday the federal government enacted some new mortgage rules to make homeownership actually more difficult. This is one of the sort of contradictions, because our federal government continues to hold out the idea that homeownership is the greatest and most desirable end goal of all housing policy. Everyone should be pushed towards homeownership, except they've noticed what happened in the United States over the last decade or so, when they had the kind of ownership mantra, and they began to develop all sorts of crazy financial instruments like subprime mortgages and so on, in order to drive even people with no income and no assets into home ownership. And not only did that kill housing in the United States, but it practically collapsed the entire global economy. So there's this inherent contradiction. On the one hand, our federal government would desperately like everyone to become homeowners. They think that is the greatest good when it comes to housing. But they're also, practically speaking, making it more difficult for first-time home buyers, for other people who have a limited amount of assets in order to put down a down payment and so on. And so my question to the federal government, and this is the fourth time in 2 years that they've actually made it harder for Canadians to buy homes. My question to them is, you're making it harder for Canadians to buy homes. Where's your rental housing strategy? Where's the rest of the housing continuum, the affordable, subsidized housing, and so on? Because if part of your policy is deliberately to make it more difficult for Canadians to get mortgages in order to protect the stability of the mortgage market and help the banks out in that way, then what are you doing about the range of housing needs of Canadians? So we really do have to get back to this notion of housing as a continuum. I did want to just simply say to Andrew that I think that the point that he raises is an interesting point, and it actually reminds me of a conversation I had a few years ago when I was on holiday in Cuba, and I actually met a fellow who was a high school teacher, and he invited me to come speak to his class about housing and homelessness in Canada. And at the end of the class, somebody said, why do you have private ownership of land in Canada? That's the source of all your problems. And I said that I thought that was an interesting observation, but I didn't think that as a practical political agenda we were going to be able to do much on that front. And I'm sorry to say that, while I think Andrew raises some important points about land and rent-seeking activity, as being some of the underlying drivers that are causing a lot of the perversions in our housing markets and the distortions that are ultimately leading to housing crisis and homelessness. I don't see any political will to take on any of those issues at all. And so if Andrew or others have a good idea on how we can engage the political classes on this issue, I don't see any appetite anywhere on the political spectrum, left, right, or center, to take on some of these fundamental issues.
Yeah, I also think, Andrew, that what you're saying is correct, and I'd mentioned that it's speculation in land and property, right, which is one of the main problems. But you must recognize that here we are talking about human beings. We are talking about fundamental human dignity, right? And the realization of that is, or the respect of that is difficult unless someone has a secure home to live in. And so it's much more than just rent seeking or the statistics of land or how much land is worth. Essentially, you have to provide shelter. You have to provide a house. So the right to housing is not a separate right. You have to see it in as we were talking about indivisibility. It has to be seen with other rights, and there's a very strong link to land, of course. But in terms of mobilizing for something which includes the very important participation of people at the grassroots level, of homeless people, of people who are living in inadequate and poor conditions, I don't see how land as a sort of mobilizing tool would appeal to them. But the house would, right?
You know what, Andrew? We'd love to hear from you, but there are just a bunch of other hands up, and we have only about 10 minutes left. But thank you for that. And let's go on. Maybe I'll take 2 questions now and then get Michael and Miloon to respond. Please.
Hi, my name is Shayna Plout, and among other things, I'm a PhD student at UBC. And I always I appreciate it when international human rights is used to look at the West. And as somebody who used to work for Amnesty International, I know we got really sick and tired of always pointing fingers over there, but not actually looking at ourselves. The majority of my academic work and activist work is actually with Roma in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. And I'm wondering if we might be able to learn something about what's happened and is happening in Central and Eastern Europe, where a lot of the pressure has been placed on the state level in order to try and bring about changes for Roma and the systemic discrimination there. But a lot of the violence and the problems are actually taking place on a local level. And so when I'm listening to this conversation, and a lot of this is talk about federal and supporting the federal, I'm also a little bit sobered and want to make sure that we pay attention to the power that the local level has in both creating a culture of inclusion and dignity or also undermining it, and what can be done both politically and socially to be able to really work on that local level, that not in my backyard problem, that we don't want them here problem, before kind of overriding that on a federal perspective.
Great, thank you. One more question. Who's got the mic? There's someone up in the far corner there. Please.
My name is Imtiaz Papat with Co-op Radio, and Miloon, you mentioned the responsibility of the city. And our mayor's made a commitment to eliminate housing or homelessness by the year 2015, and now he wants to talk about housing for not so poor people. But there's responsibility around the quality of housing as well. I think we're not talking about that. We actually have slums in the city, and the fact that they're dilapidated houses, and the fact that the city councils are not taking responsibility of going after slumlords who are charging exorbitant rents. And people living in really poor conditions, in very, very bad situations in the downtown east side and elsewhere. So that's the lack of responsibility of government about the quality of housing we're getting. That these slumlords are taking money and in fact throwing people out after taking their money, and then not taking responsibility or the city's not taking responsibility to make sure that their standards and these landlords keep up to these standards as well.
Great. So really 2 questions that focus on aspects of the local level. First, how to engage the local level critically, and then also in particular what to do about quality of housing for non and low-income individuals. Miloon.
Well, I think thanks for the comment and the question. The Roma case is very, very important because actually what's happened in parts of Europe is that it's actually municipalities that have actively discriminated against the Roma and led to their ghettoization and burning of homes and evictions. And they have encouraged other communities, non-Roma people to, in fact, they've been emboldened by that to continue to discriminate to the extent where, thousands of Roma have had to leave. So obviously, the issue of a non-discrimination approach, which is part of what I was explaining in the right to the city, is very important, and it's very much a municipal responsibility to have inclusive zoning to ensure that there is availability of services. So certainly, I think it goes back to the point of saying that we cannot let the municipalities off the hook. And I think this leads directly to the second question, that if municipalities were applying the human rights approach, the first thing they would do is make an assessment of where the vulnerable people are living in the city. So where are the kind of people living that you're talking about? Under what conditions are they living? And what is it that... So a citywide housing policy would emerge from what needs to be done for the most vulnerable. It would not emerge from what needs to be done for home ownership. So, that's a fundamental, a radical change, and that's what we would look for. And that's where municipalities do have a lot of space. And I can say in a country like Canada, they have a lot of resources, unlike in some countries in the South. So there is absolutely no excuse that year on year people continue to live in the conditions that you're explaining. And that was my observation. It's been my observation coming back here that every time I come, I hear about new task forces, about new commissions, about new policies, new targets to end homelessness. But why is it that we have to wait until 2012 to do that? I mean, the affordability crisis, the homelessness crisis has been there in Vancouver for quite a long time. Obviously, the government is not serious, right? I don't know, maybe some of you have comments on it.
Michael.
I think the slumlord question is one that has many dimensions to it. A little while back, in January, I think it was, Marketplace, the CBC consumer program, did a very interesting piece about one of the biggest landlords in the country, the biggest and richest landlords in the country, that owns properties in many provinces and is also one of the worst slumlords in the country. And the conditions were absolutely appalling. This is a company that's structured as what's called a REIT, a real estate investment trust, which is a corporate structure designed to maximize profits and minimize any kind of investment in the basics like proper standards for the tenants. So when we talk about slumlords, there's often a sort of notion that they're these kind of people that live below the cracks or something, but in fact there's some of the biggest corporate landlords in the country are operating some of the worst conditions. What we really need on a practical basis in order to tackle the slumlords are two things. We need, first of all, effective building standards and enforcement of those building standards, and that's primarily a municipal responsibility in most parts of Canada. So municipalities need to get tough, as Miloon has said, about this notion that housing rights includes habitable housing. That means that it should be housing where there's not mold, where there aren't other health issues and health disasters. We know from the work that we've done, from the mapping work we've done in a number of Canadian cities, that the worst housing is also the most unhealthy housing, that people are literally getting sick and dying because of the poor quality of their housing. So one issue is to get serious about building standards and enforcement of those standards, but we also know that we've got to also get some money into that housing. And at the very beginning of my presentation, I talked about how the federal government, in its latest round of housing cuts, has cut the National Low-Income Housing Repair Program. This is a program about $125 million a year across the country. Not a lot of money, but it was specifically geared to providing some resources to fix up some of the worst housing in the country. That program has been cut dramatically, and by 2014 will be gone entirely. So the sort of carrot and the stick approach, we need some good, strong sticks on the part of municipalities to ensure standards, and the carrot is we need to actually ensure that we have funds that are available to ensure the housing can get fixed up.
Thanks. Another question. You know what? I think there's a person with his hand up before you, behind you, but maybe we'll get a mic brought to him, and then you can have a turn to ask your question as a second question.
Hi. Thanks,
Hello.
Miloon, for your presentation. My name is Dave Eddy. I'm with Vancouver Native Housing Society. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Dave.
Michael, no, not Nick, Dave.
I just said Dave, sorry.
Oh, yeah, Michael and I presented at the House Subcommittee on Housing a number of years ago in support of Libby Davis's bill. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I think is a success story and in housing in Vancouver, and that is Vancouver Native Housing Society. By the end of next year, we'll have added about 350 units of housing in 5 or 6 different buildings. And so it is possible to get new housing built. It's difficult, and you got to be really persistent and antagonistic and really go after it. But I'd also like to invite you to a new building we opened less than a month ago. It's 2 blocks from here. It's a spectacular architectural achievement, a marriage of Victorian and Aboriginal heritage, and with many, many cultural enhancements in the building, and a very warm and Aboriginally friendly atmosphere. So I just want you to know it's not all doom and gloom.
What's the name of the building, Dave?
It's Squatch Eyes Healing Lodge, and that name was given to us by Chief Ian Campbell of the Squamish Nation, and it's the area that was known as Squatch Eyes pre-contact, and it was an area that was part of Falls Creek, so it was quite marshy, but had a lot of underground springs. And these springs were regarded as portals to the spirit realm, and Chief described it as a place for transformation. And that fits in with what we're trying to do through our arts program. We have an art gallery in the building. We have a healing lodge. We want to house mainly Aboriginal artists, and we want to move them through their personal and professional development by using the space as a production space and workshop, and then selling their art at fair trade through the gallery.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for letting us know about that. Go
Margot,
ahead.
2
can
blocks
I
away.
just try to link to the earlier discussion? In these housing units you were able to build, what was the role of the municipality? I mean, did they cooperate? Or what?
Mostly to make it really difficult, which to me is stunning. I mean, the mayor wants to end street homelessness by 2015, and the politicians are very supportive, but I find the bureaucracy, particularly the legal bureaucracy at the city, has slowed down the process immensely. We also have another project of 103 units on what's called one of the 12 city sites, and that's been delayed at least a year by bureaucracy. But the city is supportive, for sure. The provincial government, in my opinion, has been great, and the feds almost aren't there. We did get some federal money for this last project, but it was through cultural enhancements and stimulus dollars as well.
Thank you. I think there's a question right down here in the hang on for the mic, and then we'd love to hear your comment.
My name is Marie-Claire Valiquet, and what you've talked about, I'm going through this renovation, eviction, high rent, and mold in the building and all kinds of stuff. I've given my notice because I've given up about this place, and I wanted to go to human rights. Do you have any suggestion of how a tenant who is having so much trouble as me and many other people, what to do? Do we go to human rights and we file? Is it worth it to do something, or just let it go and try to leave and go somewhere else? And this is my comment.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Michael, I'm going to go to you first. Two sets of questions to respond to.
First of all, to Marie-Claire, that the struggle you're facing is a very personal struggle, and you need to make some basic decisions about how you carry this struggle forward. Know that there is support in the community. I'm not as familiar with every part of Canada. I'm certainly not as familiar with Vancouver, but there are legal advocates who are prepared to support tenants who want to fight. There are housing advocates who are prepared to support tenants who are prepared to fight. Not every tenant wants to fight, and I understand that, and I understand the personal calculations that go into that. But what I would encourage you to do, and I'm sure there are people in the audience, and certainly there are people that you can be connected to through AM and AM Joe Hall and others who can actually provide you with practical support that you need. And so I would say to you that tenants do need to carry on a struggle. It is a fight, but not every fight is one that every tenant wants to take on. So it's a personal issue for you. I want to say to Dave, congratulations, first of all, on your new building, and of course, the work that you do at Vancouver Native Housing Society is well known to those of us in other parts of Canada. You are a stunning success story. If you go back to Miloon's report, his fact-finding mission report, one of the important observations that Miloon made is that Canada actually has a lot of impressive success stories. We actually do know what does need to be done, and often when we're dwelling on the nature and the size and the scale and scope of the housing crisis and the homelessness disaster, we sometimes don't spend enough time commenting on the fact that there actually are housing success stories right across the country. And the reason why we're in such dire straits now in terms of housing is not because we don't know what to do and we don't have people that have great ideas. It's because of a combination of other systemic factors that are holding us back. And I just simply say, as a small plug to the Wellesley Institute, on our website, as one way to try and illustrate this very important point that Miloon made in his fact-finding mission about the nature of the successful housing initiatives right across the country. We have a Canadian housing e-map. It's a Google map. There's now close to 400 housing initiatives in every part of the country, all of them different, all of them successful in their own ways. And we're probably only got a fraction of the ones that are actually out there, but that's just because we only have limited resources to add to the site. But I do think it's really important to celebrate the successes, to be clear about proclaiming the fact that civil society knows what to do. Aboriginal organizations know how to deliver Aboriginal housing that reflects Aboriginal cultural value on reserve and in urban areas. You guys are a shining example of that, and there are dozens of other shining examples in every other part of the country. So let's not forget that, but let's understand that when we focus on the systemic barriers that are preventing more of these housing successes from happening, we're not minimizing the great work that you guys are doing.
Thank you, Michael. I noticed that we're at the time of closing, and I want to give the floor to Miloon maybe for maybe some last. Well, but I was going to first say that these are really a couple of wonderful notes on which to end. So, Marie-Claire, you remind us of the personal cost involved and the importance of thinking about individuals who face the sorts of issues that we've talked about at a more general legal and policy level. And again, Dave, you remind us, as Michael said so clearly, that we need to celebrate our victories and gain strength for them to carry on, to strive for more victories. So this is a nice moment and also a nice reminder of the great work that Michael and the Wellesley Institute do. So thank you for that, Michael. And Miloon, I wanted to ask you if in closing, you had anything you wanted to add to the conversation.
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. I think what many of you are doing is fantastic work, but I would just, if I can, encourage you to mobilize more, to organize more, to speak out more, to go out on the streets more. I sometimes find that lacking in Canada. I think there is a sense of, I'm not saying with all of you, but there is a sense of complacency, and I think I mean, there are other countries where people face similar problems, but they're doing more collectively. And as Michael is saying, there are many good examples. There are many, very effective NGOs working. I mean, we are all there at the international level to offer support. But if you organize more locally and carry out more advocacy, I'm sure the situation will improve. But I'd like to thank everybody again for coming and for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me also just add thanks to Anne Johal and to Laurie Anderson, to SFU, and to the Woodwards Community Program for organizing and supporting this event, to all of you for coming and contributing in such an important and engaging way. And finally, to our two guests. Michael, wonderful to have you with us. It's late in Toronto. Go home, have a good night's sleep. You did well tonight, and really we're deeply appreciative of your involvement. And Miloon, thank you so much. This is just another installment of our continuing conversation with you. I hope you're back soon. I know that you're somewhat overbooked for the time you're here, but please take that just as indication of how much we value your presence. So thank you so much for tonight.